Dear student, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Mr. Darcy. I teach English Language 1. The lesson is about language terminologies. This language terminologies is under the topic of Introduction to Language. In order to understand these concepts, our discussion will be guided by a question that reads, why and how can a language become international? So in answering this question, we will be looking at the factors that can make a language become international. But before we go into those factors, let us try to understand a bit about what is international language. So the understanding of what is international language in relation to the factors that we are going to look at thereafter will finally help us to know how can a person categorize a certain language to be an international one. An international language is a language which is spoken across its boundaries. A language that is spoken between nations. That when we talk about language being spoken across its boundaries, what does it mean? We simply mean that language is culturally bound. It has a certain area, a locality, where it has to be spoken. So when it is spoken beyond its boundary, that is when we talk about a language being spoken across its boundary. So maybe a good question that one can ask himself is, does it mean that any language which is spoken across its boundary could be an international language? The answer there becomes no. Because a language can sometimes be spoken across its boundary and yet it's not an international language. So for this case, we'll need to examine the criteria, the factors that can qualify a language to become international when it is spoken across its boundaries. So when we want to look into those factors, I would want us to ask these two questions, and thereafter we'll see if they qualify or not. The questions goes like, why is Chinese not an international language despite having a great number of speakers? And then two is, the second question reads, why is Kiswahili an international language? So when you look at these two questions, they're like trying to oppose one another. One wants you to support that a certain language is an international language, and the other one needs you to negate that you have to say in the opposite way. So in order for you to go through the two questions, you need to understand what are the criteria, what are the factors that makes a language becomes international. And with that, it will help you thereafter to know whether it is Chinese or Kiswahili or any other language that qualifies to be an international language. So in this case, at the end of this discussion, it is expected that every one of us would be able to say whichever language that it comes across him or her, he or she would be able to say whether a language is an international language or not. So let us look at the factors that makes a language international. Factors for a language to be international language? The first one says a language should be spoken by a great number of speakers. The language should be spoken by a great number of speakers. So, great number of speakers is one of the points. But how do we know that a language is spoken by many people? Or what kind of speakers are we talking here? We need to have speakers who speak that language as their first language. There should be speakers who speak the language as their first language. Or in other words, it is called mother tongue. Some other people say they speak it as their native language. So I've talked about first language, mother tongue, and native language. What do we mean by those? First language, it is a language that a person speaks as he or she was brought up. So in other words, he or she automatically find it in his or her life. He acquired from the childhood. And as I said, it is sometimes also called a mother tongue. But it's not necessary to be the language which is spoken by your mother. Your mother might be spoken or speaking a different language, and yet you are brought in a situation where a different language is spoken. So that language which you encounter as you are brought up, that becomes your mother tongue. So this is one among the speakers we are talking here. But in addition, for that language to become an international language, in this point of having a great number of speakers, the language must have people speaking it as their second language. There must be people speaking the language as their second language. Second language simply means that a language which is spoken by people in addition to the first language that they have already mastered. But in this case, we are not talking about any language which a person add. That one will depend on the society. In this case, it is a society which will declare or which will appoint a certain language to becomes a second language to the society. In other words, this second language, it is equated to an official language. So I have another term there, official language. So it is the government which appoint a certain language to be spoken at a certain area or a certain society as an additional language apart from the existing language. If I may give you an example, in our society, that we speak Kiswahili as a first language. I'm talking about as Tanzanians. That Kiswahili is the language that has been declared as a major means of communication in our country. And it's the government who did it. And we call it a national language for that matter. The language for the all Tanzanians. Whether they know how to speak it or they don't, but it is their language. The additional language which is in our society, apart from Kiswahili, it is English language, which in this case, English language, it is said to be the second language, in addition to Kiswahili, which is the first one. So we are calling English as an official language in a sense that it fulfills some of the governmental or internal governmental functions. I repeat there, that we call English as an official language because it fulfills some of the internal governmental functions. And probably when we find that Kiswahili could have never fulfilled the purpose. During those times, when we declared Kiswahili as a national language, to be used as a medium of communication in primary schools and in many other government offices, plus in secondary schools, then Kiswahili failed to fulfill some of the functions. And this is the point where the government had to take English back and make it an official language, in addition to Kiswahili, because Kiswahili is also an official language. The other speakers whom we are expecting to add in this group, it is those ones who speak the language as their foreign language. So this FL stands for foreign language. So in this case, a foreign language, it is whatever language which is spoken that comes from abroad. And people learn it for their own specific reason. The government does not force one to learn the language like the official one or the second language. So in this case, in our country, we can think about a language like French to be a foreign language. Currently, even Chinese, we can call it a foreign language because we have people speaking Chinese as an additional language. So the group which makes a language to become international, to fulfill factor number one, it has to have people of this category. People speaking the language as a first language, as the second language, and as their foreign language. That's number one. Widely spoken worldwide. Widely spoken worldwide. Another person could say, to what extent the language is spoken across the world? We are talking about the geographical dispersion. How worldwide the language is spread. We know this world, it has got many continents and it has many nations. And so here we are referring to how many nations, how many countries they speak the language. How many nations they use the language in their communication, whether internally or with other people outside the country. So with this, it will thereafter qualifies the first point, that if the language is spoken by many other countries, they will speak it as either an additional language to become second language, and or they will speak it as an additional language, which means a foreign language. That is the second point. The third point that qualifies a language to become an international language is They technically term it as vehicular load. But in simple language, we simply say the functions that a language performs worldwide, or the functions that a language performs internationally. What functions does the language perform? There are several functions. One, it could be used as a medium of communication in international forums. This is one of the use. The language can be used to broadcast different international news. The language can as well be used in international trades and businesses. And you can name many more other international functions, and whereby it brings people as they want to communicate. So once a language does perform that kind of a function, it is said to be an international language. But people went further, saying because of this new technology, the so-called science and technology, we have a lot of different news or different equipments which might be invented from other countries whose the language is not international. Now, in order for them to see how best they can make their technology reach to many people worldwide, they can think about which language they should use. They might not use the language, for instance. They can use a language which is understood as an international language to make their technology reach many people worldwide. So that kind of a language, it can as well be known as international language. Have an example, for example. You might have an equipment, maybe, being made from Finland. Those guys speak Finnish. And Finnish is not an international language. It's not worldwide known. So they might think of which language should they use to make their technology reach to the society or to the world. So they can employ one of the language which they think it can facilitate and or it can do the purpose. And the last factor for this matter, it is the influence of the native speakers. How influential the native speaker can be, that it can make them influence other people to speak their language. So the influence, it can be categorized in 3 points. The native speaker can be socially influenced, that their well-being as they live in the world, some other people might admire them. So, admiring them the way they live, it could attract them even to think about the language they use. They would also want to use it. But the same again, there are other countries, they are politically powerful. They sometimes dictate what other countries should do in terms of the way they run their systems. So if they have that, they definitely also have to be economically powerful. So these other people, they are not willingly learn the language, but they are in one way or another influenced to learn the language. So the native speakers, if they are socially, politically, and or economically powerful, as I said before, they can influence other people to speak and or to use their language. And that is factor number 4. And these are the points and or the features that make a language becomes international. So here comes a question. Why Chinese is not considered as an international language despite having a great number of speakers? We have gone through the features. Now, if I may ask you, do you think the Chinese language qualifies? So you say, why is Chinese not considered? It is because of it is not qualified in all these. Of course, from the question itself, that is, despite having a great number of speakers. But if you could get through point number one, where we said that the great number of speakers should be speaking the language in three different categories. That there should be speakers whose the language is their native language or is their mother tongue. For this case, Chinese qualifies because it has a great number of native speakers. But when you think about who else speak Chinese as their second language, this is where you start having some problem. If you go around the world, ask yourself, which country they speak Chinese as an official language? That when you go to the offices, you can choose either to speak the language of the indigenous and or to speak Chinese. That's where you get a problem. But of course, there are some countries where the citizens, they speak Chinese as their foreign language. We have some of them even here in Tanzania, that they speak Chinese. So we find in point number one, Chinese does not qualify. When it comes to number two, where we said the language should be spoken worldwide, there should be a great dispersion of the people, of the countries who speak the language. In this case, again, we see Chinese as a language is not spoken across the world. It's not spoken in many countries. So it's not widely spread. So again, it disqualifies itself to be an international language. Coming to a point of what functions does the language performs worldwide? It may be there are some radio and TV stations in China which they use Chinese to broadcast their news. But when it comes to broadcasting different international news, we haven't seen Chinese being used. In international trade, yes, but not very wide, because we see the Chinese are trading with other people in other countries. But the question there is, do they use Chinese as a language? Or they have to learn the language of those other friends so that they can trade and or they can do business. In international forums, Chinese is not used. As for the case of UN or AU and any other international meeting, we don't see Chinese as one of the language which is used there. And the last point about the native speakers should be politically, socially, and economically powerful to an extent that they can influence other people in other nations to speak their language. This one, I'm hesitant to say that economically, the native speakers of China, they're a bit powerful, but they miss these are the two factors that their influence to other people or to other countries, it is still very low. We are just now seeing what the Chinese are doing. They are trying to influence different other countries to start using the language. As it is said that language is not static. Language is dynamic. So soon or later, don't be surprised to be told that Chinese is an international language. It might qualify all these other factors. Just as what happened to Kiswahili. So we have seen that why Chinese is not an international language. So the point again comes, why Kiswahili is considered as international language? So Kiswahili is an international language because it qualifies these factors. If you could look at point number one, that it has to have people speaking the language as the native language. Other countries, there should be people speaking it as a second language. And other people in other countries speaking it as a foreign language. Kiswahili qualifies that. A point of geographical dispersion, how widely spread. We have seen Kiswahili is spoken in many, many countries. Talk about Kenya, South Africa, America, Germany, just to name a few. There are so many places where Kiswahili is spoken. And in fact, even in many international universities, Kiswahili is taught as a subject. I'm told even in China itself, Kiswahili is one among the languages. So in widespread, Kiswahili qualifies. And when it comes to number three, that if Kiswahili performs different functions worldwide, we are all witnesses that Kiswahili performs several functions worldwide. We hear different international news are being broadcast in Kiswahili. Who have not heard about BBC, Voice of America, and others? We are told, and it is there, that Kiswahili is used as one among the medium of communication in international forums like AU. And in fact, I'm not very certain that they say they want Kiswahili to be the language of Africa. So this makes Kiswahili to be able to perform different functions worldwide. And lastly, about the influence, the Tanzanians, they are very polite. And them being polite, and plus the peace that we have in our country, everybody in this world likes to live in Tanzania. Having that, people in one way or another, they were forced to learn Kiswahili. So because of our social well-being, many people worldwide, they have learned Kiswahili. And so we have socially influenced the people around the world to learn Kiswahili. And that qualifies Kiswahili to be one of the international languages. As I said earlier when I was discussing about Chinese, I said in some years to come, don't be surprised to be told that Chinese is an international language. Just like as it was, that Kiswahili, some years back, it was not an international language because it has its limited use. And even the speakers, they were only here in Tanzania. But now that Kiswahili, it has gone across its boundary, and it is spoken in many, many other areas, it is now qualifying. So I'm pretty sure with the force that the Chinese are coming with, they'll definitely, end of this world, make their language become an international language. Now let me ask you a question. From this discussion, that Chinese is not an international language, Kiswahili is an international language. The question here comes now. Yeah, as I said, with this discussion about whether a Chinese is not an international language and Kiswahili is an international language, you can come up with this question like, is there a language which is more superior than the other? We have many languages in this world. What do you say? Let's look at Kiswahili. Let's look at English. Let's look at Chinese. And any other language you can mention. Do you think there is a language which is more superior than the other? There are people who say yes. There are languages which are considered to be more superior than the other. But linguistically, we say no. We don't have such. We simply say all languages are equal. So, which side would you base? You can decide to say there are languages which are more superior than the other by having your own stance. And on the other hand, you can talk of having a view of we don't have a superior language. Now, if you are to argue in one of those areas, which points are you coming up with? Those who says all languages are equal, they would come up with the idea like, since human beings are equal, as from the word of God, that you cannot say one person is superior than the other by looking at their color. Since we are all having the same organs, and we all have been created by the same Father, we say God created man and he gave him language to help him or her in communicating. So that could be the first reason why we are saying all languages are equal, because all languages are spoken by human beings. But in addition to that, it is used by human beings to perform several functions in the society. So what it is performed by Kiswahili, it is also performed by English. And it can as well be performed by even Kigogo or any other language that you can mention. So as they do share the same functions in the society, we cannot in any way say one language is more superior than the other. Apart from that, when you talk about the characteristics of language, we don't have any other language or any language which it has many more other characteristics compared to the other. If we talk about displacement, all languages does the same. If we talk about creativity, all human beings perform the same. So the characteristics of language, they are shared by all languages. They do not isolate one from the other. That is why, again, we say all languages are equal. Leave alone the characteristics. Talk about the significance, the importance of language. How important the language is in the society. Whatever you think here in Tanzania, it is the same as what it happens in other areas where they speak different language apart from Kiswahili. So those few points, they qualify the view that says all languages are equal, that we don't have a language which is superior than the other. But when it comes now to the social point of view, you find people say languages are not equal. Why? They say, if you look at people, though it is believed that we are the same, but human beings are different. There are people of a higher status and others with a low status. So those people who use a language that we think that they are of a higher status, we can even consider the language that they speak is of a higher status. I just want to give you an example of Kiswahili and English. Even when you go around in Tanzania, a person who happens to speak English is considered to be of a higher status than the one speaking in Kiswahili. Think about the today's existence that we take our kids into English medium primary schools. And of course, there are others who are taking them to their public primary schools, where Kiswahili is a medium of instruction. When you take these kids back home, the one speaking English is believed to be of a high knowledge. Even you, my friend, are from sixes. When you are through with your education and you go back to the street, you can't speak English, you only speak Kiswahili. Those guys in street will keep saying you have gone for school for nothing. Simply because we believe that whoever speaks English, it is of a higher status. Those are the people who are considering that languages are not equal in terms of that. You can even, again, take an example of, you go around in the street, you find someone is holding a newspaper written The Guardian, and another one pick a newspaper written Tazama. Then how do you view these two? Even if that person who holds The Guardian can't read English, but he'll be categorized or put in a certain level which is higher than the other one who took Tazama. So what I'm trying to say here is, really in the society, languages are not viewed in the same way. But apart from that, or in addition, the language which has been well documented or being used in many literatures or many books worldwide, we consider that language to be of a higher status because of its use. Not only being documented, but even the way it is used worldwide. So if a language is used only at this area, in another language it has been spread all over, there is no way you can say these two languages are equal. I want you now to know that despite Chinese not being an international language and Kiswahili being an international language, when you go to street, whoever speaks Chinese, don't be surprised some people categorizing Chinese as a superior language comparing to Kiswahili. Just because they're trying to look at these two. Who is more powerful than the other? But in conclusion, we can simply say that so long as language is used for communication, you can decide to base on either of the side. Finally, I would want to draw your attention on language in general, that language, it has not started today, though it wasn't there before. It started sometime, somewhere after the existence of man. There are several views which talks about the origin of language. But I don't want to go into that. I just want to let you know that just after we had language, there are a lot of things that happen. You know, language is used by people, and it is a product of the society. So in that matter, when the society changes, the language changes as well. What we see today is not the way how it was years back. Now, since the society has changed, the language has changed as well. So you need also to know that the language we are using today might not be the same that we are going to use some years after. And in that, I want you to know that there is what we call language change and language death. There are some languages which were there in previous days, but we don't have them today. What happened that a language died? Do you think it's only a human being who can die? No, my friend. Even the language dies. So as you're asking yourself, how can a language die? The answer could be very simple, that when the language loses its user and people no longer use it in their daily communication, definitely that language will perish slowly. Think about these tribal languages that we have in Tanzania. Some years back, they were very common. They were spoken. People were very prestigious to speak the language. But as time comes, these children, as they now think of speaking English, they don't want to show that they can speak that tribal language. And since the users of those languages decrease, even its use decrease as well. But so it will reach a time you will only hear people say, there was a language called so and so, but who speak it anymore? That is language death. But apart from language death, there are other languages which they can develop. That means they increase their users and they increase their use as well. So when you leave speaking your own language, as you speak the other language, you automatically make that language develop. But I'm not saying that we should now go back. Remember, those languages are not used in our normal schooling time. And they're not official. We only use them if we want to communicate some social activities at home. So the insistence is, we need to look at these things in different angles. As we have different speakers, not only language change, meaning dying and developing, we can also find variation among ourselves. The way I speak is not the way you speak. the kind of vocabulary I use, they're not the same that you use. But as long as when you speak and I speak, end of the day, we understand one another, that's enough. And that's all about language use. Thank you very much.